Hello. Today I will be speaking with Professor McGruder, Professor of History at Antioch College. Professor McGruder has spent many years of his life working within nonprofit community development and now as an academic researcher who researches urban history, African American institutions, and gay and lesbian history. Professor McGruder is also interested in the history of Harlem and has published a book called Race and Real Estate, Conflict and Cooperation in Harlem, which is one of the many topics we will be discussing today. We would like to begin by asking, what was your inspiration to become an expert in public health, community outreach, community program and outreach, African American institutions, and gentrification? Do you have a personal connection to this subject matter?
I didn't start out kind of coming out of college with the goal of being an expert, but I pursued things that were interesting to me. I was an economics major in college, and my senior year took a seminar on the economics of discrimination and did a paper on my hometown, racial residential patterns in my hometown of Toledo, Ohio. And that got me interested in the field of community development, and then ended up working in that field for a long time. And eventually, 3 years after graduation, went back and got my MBA in real estate finance from Columbia. And being in New York connected me with Harlem. And this was the 1980s. There was a lot of challenges. The city owned 60% of the vacant housing in Harlem at the time that had been abandoned in the 1970s. And by 1986, I got involved with a group of volunteers with the Abyssinian Baptist Church that were developing plans for a community development corporation that became the Abyssinian Development Corporation. And eventually, from 1991 to 1997, I was director of real estate development and then chief operating officer there. And we were doing renovating basically mainly city-owned buildings using the low-income housing tax credit. And at the same time, I got very interested in Harlem history and had an opportunity to teach as an adjunct at Baruch College. And that's really kind of how I came into kind of beginning to think about academia. But before that, after I left the Development Corporation, I had joined a local nonprofit organization, all volunteer organization, Gay Men of African Descent, in 1987. And that was really at the early years of the AIDS and HIV crisis, and Black gay men were being hit very hard by that. And as a Black gay man, I was seeing friends die. We were looking for ways to support each other, and that was a membership organization. Started out as a weekly meeting in different people's apartments, and soon outgrew that and began meeting at the Lesbian and Gay Community Center. And so through the 80s and 90s, I got increasingly involved, and eventually in the mid-90s was on their board of directors. And when I left the Abyssinian Development Corporation in 1997, I left because the director of GMAT, actually we'd had kind of two successive directors in the short period of time, and another search was about to start. And I was thinking about what else might I do after the Development Corporation that would be as interesting and challenging. And I applied to become executive director of GMAT and served in that role from 1997 to 2001. And that was at a pivotal times in terms of AIDS and HIV funding. The Centers for Disease Control was beginning to shift its funding pattern and fund community-based organizations, which it had not done in the past. And because Black gay men were so hard hit with that, organizations across the country have been lobbying the CDC, and GMAT was part of that. And there were some funding requests for proposals that came out that we applied to and got funding. And so the 4 years I was there was a period of tremendous growth in terms of the organization. We're mainly doing HIV prevention work, but also began doing technical assistance. Eventually, one of the grants we got from the CDC called for us to provide technical assistance to 9 northeastern states in the U.S. Virgin Islands. And so our budget grew quintupled in 4 years. We moved twice. And so I guess I'm saying all that to say that I didn't enter kind of think about careers. I want to be an expert in this, but there were things that required me to develop expertise in different fields. And that's what, I ended up doing. And so the things that we were doing at GMAT definitely exposed me to the field of public health, the language, the way that the messaging, and it really kind of extended what I had been doing in the housing areas. How do you have strong communities if people are not in good health and don't have resources for that health? You can renovate all the housing you want to, but if you're not addressing that, then something's missing. And so, those were the things that, really challenged me and excited me in terms of the work.
Great, that is such an inspiring story. So we're trying to focus currently on kind of real estate and how that has affected Washington Heights community. So we kind of want to tie it back to your book, Race and Real Estate. And in that book, you discuss the way in which African American population increased dramatically in Harlem, not only to escape poverty, but to establish kind of a long-lasting community. Could you briefly discuss the ways in which African American people migrated to Harlem and worked to actually purchase the real estate there?
The book looks at the period 1890 to 1920, and the dominant narrative regarding Harlem history was that in the first decade of the 1900s, Black people arrive in Harlem in larger numbers. And what I was challenging that dominant narrative to really show that Black people were already there. Their numbers were small, but there was a small Black enclave right where the Lenox Terrace apartment buildings are now, complexes now, 133rd, 134th, 135th Streets between Lenox and 7th and 5th Avenue. They were there by 1900. And but what happens, the first subway line opened in 1904, and there was a stop at 135th and Lenox Avenue that was scheduled. And so that made that property, that location, more valuable. The attraction that had brought them there was the practice that was already taking place, is that Black people were being steered to different neighborhoods, and that steering allowed for the white property owners to charge them higher rents than they would white people. And that's why they were there. But that's why it was only those 3 blocks. Most of the other areas of Harlem, which was still, there was a lot of vacant land in Harlem in 1890. And with the opening of the subway, there begins kind of a scramble for control of Harlem. There was an attempt to evict the Black people on those blocks by a large real estate firm, and Black entrepreneurs, including Philip Payton, who founded the Afro-American Realty Company. They began buying property from, in some cases, from really cooperative white owners, and they blocked that attempt by others to oust them. And so part of what they do in terms of ownership is, it may sound, kind of just, well, of course, but it wasn't that easy to own. And in terms of real estate, if people don't want to sell you something, they don't have to. And that's what I was looking at with these they're German Americans mainly, and it's three people really, but it was pivotal properties that they sold to these Black people and helped them to finance in some cases. And that provides an anchor. And then Peyton and others use that as an opening to buy other property. So on the real estate side, that's what they do. But the other thing I wanted to show in race and real estate, that when people talk about Black people moving to cities during this period, it's almost like this mass of, just a crowd of Black people just crowding into these neighborhoods. And what I showed is that they are coming to these neighborhoods looking for the same opportunity that the white immigrants who were moving to neighborhoods were looking for. They were looking for better schools for their children, better housing. Harlem was new then. And so the housing that they got was much better than the housing that they had if they were living in the Tenderloin district, which is Midtown Manhattan, roughly between 23rd and maybe 55th Street or so. That's between 6th and 8th Avenue. That's where the Black population was concentrated. It wasn't the only place, but in Manhattan from the latter decades of the 1800s. So Harlem, on the housing side, it provided higher quality housing. It was new. They got better education because the schools were better. They began to bring youth serving organizations for their children, like the YWCA, the YMCA, which were segregated, but they brought the Black YMCA, the Black YWCA there. They created the music settlement for colored children or for colored people. And they wanted a thriving community. So it's not just that they're crowding into these apartments, that they're looking to develop community where they will thrive. And ownership was part of that. And so it's really that combination. Ownership allows them the long term to think long term, and and the ownership level was not high, but relative to what it had been in other areas, it was higher. And as they become the main people renting properties, like by 1920, it's very clear that the area between 135th and 145th, that's predominantly Black. And there's a period of white flight that precedes it. And what is triggering that is the real estate profession incorporated the social science of the day, which was saying that Black people brought all of these negative associations, criminality, health, and they incorporated that into the real estate industry, saying that, well, the presence of Black people will lower property values. And if you look at it from a dollars and cents point of view, those Black people in 1900 that were paying higher rents in those buildings on 135th Street, if value is based on the revenue produced by a building, the buildings that they were in were of higher value because they were generating higher rent. But that's ignored because of this notion that the presence alone will bring down a property, no matter what the rent that they're paying is. And with that, as Black people move into neighborhoods, white people start running, many. And that leads to a wave of white flight. And Black people take advantage of that because they then, Philip Payton and others, what Philip Payton talked about, he was opening up apartments for Black people. And, kind of within that phrase is that they had been closed before. And so it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy for white people. If they had stayed, Harlem might have been a multiracial community, but because they left, and for Black people were not against living with white people, but they didn't want to live with hostile white people. So when they got control of buildings, it was seen as an empowering measure. And so when you read the newspapers of the time, there is an air of, something like triumphalism as they get key properties. And so all of those things set really the stage for by the Harlem Renaissance would not have happened at that time. It wouldn't have been centered in Harlem. The Negro Renaissance of the 20s is happening in Chicago, Detroit, but New York City is the center and Harlem is pivotal because the decade before all those people were coming. If they had not come, there might have been a presence of New York during that time, but it might have been in the Tenderloin rather than in Harlem. And there wouldn't have been the kind of associations that come out of the fact that people lived right down the block from other artists. There's all of this, kind of generation of ideas that's coming because they're in that community. And so that's really when Harlem becomes known as the Black capital of the world during the 1920s. And all of that is set in motion maybe the 15 years before that.
Yeah, so as a follow-up to that, because we are exploring Washington Heights, and one of the things we struggle is that the majority of the Dominican population in this area is actually not landowners and they rent. And how you kind of spoke about how the land ownership was seen as an empowerment. Do you believe that Harlem has a slower rate of gentrification because of this land ownership?
Land ownership was important, but most Black people in Harlem did not own. It's probably less. I mean, it kind of depends on how you look at it, but so during the time I'm looking at it, my book ends in 1920. And I think in the book I mentioned there's a chapter that looks at ownership, and I believe it was under 10% then. And by Harlem, it's a different it's a different territory than we talk about now. So now when we say Harlem, we typically mean 110th to 155th Street. In 1920, Black Harlem was really 135th to 145th Street. So it's a smaller area, but ownership has always been relatively low. So it would not be accurate to think that what you're describing in the Dominican community in Washington Heights, it probably parallels Harlem.
Okay.
And I'm sure there are Dominican owners of properties, but they're not the majority. And that's really what Harlem experienced then. And so I lived in Harlem from 1985 to 2012. And so that was a period when there was a lot of change. And your question about, is it happening slower? It was happening incrementally. It was already starting to some extent, but in the 80s, the vacant buildings, basically the presence of drugs on the street and the high crime kept a lot of people away. Private real estate companies were not investing in Harlem in the 80s or even the 90s when I was with Abyssinian Development Corporation in any major way. And that's why the nonprofit development corporations were the ones to redevelop that, because private companies, for the most part, developers were not interested. That has changed probably in the 2000s, it began to change, and there's different markers for it. Some people kind of use Bill Clinton opening his office and the state office building as one, but it was happening before that. That was very visible, but it was before that. And so the brakes against gentrification in Harlem have been a high amount of public housing facilities but even with those, you probably know, there are proposals to not sell the buildings that are occupied, but to sell vacant land within public housing in Harlem to build, it looks like mixed income buildings, and those are proposals. I'm not sure if they're going to go through, but that presence has been a break on it. So I worked in Philadelphia for a while, and this is in the 80s, and there were whole blocks that they just ousted the people. I don't know exactly how, but New York has quite strong tenant protection, so it's very difficult to do that. And so then rent stabilization and rent control are the other anchors in New York, but it's happening in some cases below the radar. Um, the building I lived in for 25 years I was in Harlem, it's at St. Nicholas and 145th Street, and I kept my apartment there until 2 years ago when I sold it. I bought it in 1987 as a co-op, and I sold it to the woman who had been subletting it. And she's experiencing harassment, and the same kinds of things that we know happen in other areas. And I know they want her to move, and I've stayed in touch with her, uh, because for I I worked out a price that I knew she could afford because we got to know it. She sublet it for probably about 3 or 4 years,
Okay.
and but watching what she's experiencing is, and particularly with co-ops, because their governance is beyond the scrutiny of a lot of the legal processes. And so so that building, when I moved in, it was about 230 units. There was only one white woman in the building, and I don't know how many white people are there now, but it's my guess is probably 60 or 70% white. And what is used as a gentrification ploy is money, pricing. In rental buildings, it's just raising the rent, even though you might have rent stabilization. As you know, there's ways that owners, they usually say they're going to renovate, and the way that law works, if you renovate above a certain amount, then that gives you the right to bring that rent up.
Okay.
And so that's what's in co-op buildings. um, the market is really what's doing it. Is that in the last 15 years, the prices have gone up so much that low and moderate income people are priced out. And the people who remain in those buildings, if they're long term, they come under the same kind of harassment that that my friend in my apartment is, because they really want that apartment so they can. The way that co-op works is each sale, the co-op gets a percentage of that sale number. And so the higher that number, the more they get. And so there's some things that are driving that. And, kind of in terms of your project overall, um, in a city where the market is soft, these discussions about gentrification are kind of theoretical. And in Harlem, it's maybe hard to believe now, but in the 1980s, with the renovation that we were starting to do, we just assumed that the buildings would be nice and people would stay there, but we did not envision what's happening now. And like now it looks like, well, of course you should have seen that, but the level of change that has happened, and because people were not, the yellow cabs did not come to Harlem. They turned at 96th Street, literally. And so, and I'm not exaggerating, you could see. And so that kind of changed. And that's the hot market that New York has been. And so in that case, one of the solutions, I'm on the board of Yellow Springs Home Inc., which is an affordable housing group. And I'm in Yellow Springs, Ohio, which is about 20 miles from Dayton, Ohio, Southwest Ohio. And it's a CDC that uses the community land trust model, where any properties they build or renovate, the land is part of the community land trust. And it's a model that's used in other parts of the country as well, where the land trust owns the land. If it's a for sale building, the buyer will own the building, but the land trust owns the land, and that gives the land trust some leverage in terms of, for Yellow Springs Home Inc., when a property is resold, there's a cap on what it can be resold at, and it's calculated. And so the owner does get some equity, but doesn't get a windfall profit. And what we're saying is, you got this at an affordable level because of subsidies that went into this property. We want the next buyer to be able to experience the same thing. So you will get some equity, but you're not going to get as if this was just on the free market. And so being in a community land trust allows us to do that. And I think in New York City, there's some land trusts that are operating. I'm not as familiar with them. But in a way, in a hot market, you almost have to take the buildings out of that free market process and kind of slow that down. And so with the buildings we do in Yellow Springs, it's not saying they can't appreciate, but it's saying that the owner is not going to get all of that because they got a subsidy coming in. And I think if we had done something like that in Harlem in the 80s and 90s, a lot of the buildings that were renovated, and some are still part of the affordable housing, but some are not. And the challenge is, with the developer, that commitment is only as good as a commitment of the nonprofit to maintain it. And if they have financial challenges, pressures, and it's very enticing to say, well, let's sell this. Low-income housing tax credit only required that it remain in that for 15 years. That sounds like a long time at the beginning, but it goes very quickly. And so there's more needed to protect buildings and in a hot market like New York.
Do you have any advice on how we, maybe as a nonprofit organization, can help the Dominican community actually gain the land for their own? Some professors have mentioned that we should talk to policymakers or to some sort of local politicians. Did that seem realistic? Do you think that there is some sort of way to actually help that, especially in New York, where affordable housing can also mean quite expensive for certain low income communities?
I'm not, I haven't worked, so I've been gone from New York for 10 years, so I'm not totally up on it. In terms of affordable housing in New York, the Association for Neighborhood Housing Developers is the industry organization for nonprofit community development corporations. And they could tell you, because if they're probably members. If there is a group in that area, they're probably members of ANHD. Reason I say that is what their mission is to build housing for low and moderate income people. And the policy is important, but the underground work is going to happen, if most likely through them. If there's not one in the neighborhood, then finding one that might be interested in working with people. The challenge now, compared to in the 80s and 90s, is the city doesn't really own much property anymore. And that was the main resource for us at Abington Development Corporation in Brooklyn, the Bronx. There was all this property that the city owned. It was really mainly vacant buildings at that time. And the next stage was land, and they may own some land now, but not a lot. And so and so the reason I say a community development corporation is that whatever politicians might suggest, the organizations that are going to really execute that is going to be a community development corporation.
Okay.
And so if there's not one in Washington Heights, ones in Upper Manhattan, and A&HD can really give you a good idea about who's doing what. And also they do a lot of policy work as well. And so they could really help there. And each neighborhood has different challenges, characteristics, and they could really work with you on that. And that's really the challenge now, is that there's not a lot of properties that the city owns. The resources that are there, so the Housing Development Fund corporations, these are buildings that typically were privately owned, that often were not being well maintained by the owners. And so the city intervened and they gave the residents an opportunity to take over the management and convert them to what's called limited equity co-ops. And so limited equity co-op, it has an element very similar to a land trust, is that yes, you own your apartment, you buy it at a very nominal rate compared to the market, but when you sell it, you don't get to sell it for 500,000 when you pay 10,000 for it. There's a cap on it, so you'll get something. And so the legal entity that's created to do that is a Housing Development Fund corporation, and there's a network of them throughout the city. And my guess is there's probably an organization that works with them all. And so the reason I say that is that the ones that are in Washington Heights need to be protected, strengthened. People need to know that they're there as well, because that's where affordable housing, homeownership housing, that is what they're there for. And so if people are they're renting now, they want to buy, that's a really viable option for them. And just knowing what's there and what their needs are. And particularly some of them are struggling. And if you think about the market, I'm sure there are private developers waiting for them to fail so that they can swoop in and buy them. And so making sure those buildings are strong is really important. And A&HD could probably tell you who, if there's an organization that works with them, and then what kind of buildings are in Washington Heights then. I mean, the challenge now is that I think some of the development is now new construction. And because the renovation days of, the days of seeing vacant buildings everywhere, that's over. And new construction is very expensive in New York. And the availability of money, the low-income housing tax credit is the main federal resource. I'm not really current on kind of what kind of state dollars or the city Housing Preservation Development Corporation. I'm not up on what their programs are, but those are the three tiers of funding sources for development usually. But that land, when we were doing development in the 80s and 90s, the land cost us nothing, or if it did, it was $1. And so that's a subsidy right there. If you have to buy land at market rates, then you've got to find grant money or something almost to bring that down to zero. So it's not being passed on to the people who are in the building. And that's what makes it so more challenging. And some nonprofit CDCs have gone out of business in New York because they couldn't, there's no product. They can't develop now. And so it's definitely much more challenging than in the 80s and 90s now.
Yeah.
But a lot are still doing things. And so ANHG could really, bring you up to date on that.
And then in terms of, I guess, community dynamic, when we're looking at Washington Heights, we're kind of looking at like the social centers of where people are meeting. And one of the major places that people not only go to express their faith, but they go as a social space is churches. However, through these new developments, one of what we see is that there were around like 300 churches maybe 100 years ago, and now it's like down to 100 or so. So you kind of discuss this in your book about the I might pronounce this wrong, Abyssinian Baptist
Mhm.
Church of Harlem,
Mhm.
and you discuss how the major importance of the church for community empowerment and its importance as the spiritual center for Harlem. Could you please briefly summarize the role of faith and how churches kind of make a community? And then what have you found to be the most integral role of the church for Harlem's African American population?
Church, the church is a unifying, historically has been kind of a unifying element for Black communities during the Great Migration. This is a period after World War One, and in those decades, in some cases, Southern communities, congregations would move to northern cities, and sometimes the pastor would lead them, and they would start another church. And so there's like people often miss the fact that there's a whole lot more than worship that's happening in these places, and particularly with Black churches. I'm less familiar with the Latino experience, but I do know some things about it, and there's some parallels in that people are coming to the churches. If you're new in town, this is a good way to meet people, get social networks, get support. That's happening right now, even though the attendance is declining everywhere, almost. Um, and so they serve that purpose. Um, from a development point of view, probably from the 70s onward, in some cities, churches began to look at the role that they were playing in neighborhoods. And what that's doing is linking with the movement that goes back to the 1800s. It was called the social gospel movement. And these were Protestant and Catholic churches that they they didn't have just a sanctuary. If they were building, they would build a community house. And in that community house, you had a gym, you had a dining hall, you had classrooms. And the idea of people following the social gospel was that the church should be, so if you look at theology and Jesus and healing, feeding, caring for people, the social gospel followers are saying we shouldn't just have these beautiful buildings. We should be doing something about the neighborhood and contributing to it. And so the period that I look at, 1890 to 1920, St. Philip's Episcopal Church, when they moved to Harlem in 1909, they do exactly that. They build a sanctuary and a community house. And Hutchins Bishop, the pastor at the time, becomes a leader by the probably by the 40s. Well, no, right when they built that building on 134th Street, but they buy a row of 10 apartments on 135th Street, right around the corner from the Schomburg Center. And so they see a role that they're playing. And so there's kind of a through line there in that. So Abyssinian, when the Development Corporation gets started in the 1980s, Samuel DeWitt Proctor, who was the pastor at the time, that's exactly what he was preaching. Because when you went out of the church, across the street, almost that whole block on 138th between Lenox and 7th Avenue was vacant. And he was saying, it doesn't make sense for us to have this beautiful sanctuary, and we go out and the neighborhood is falling apart. What does that say about us as
Yeah.
Christians? And the Development Corporation really gets started out of that. And so in Washington Heights, those churches may be centers for that kind of organizing if they're not already community development corporations there. And I'm not saying that every church is going to form one, but so if organizations are working in a community, being able to go to churches and talk with people, it provides them access to a base that they can really get the pulse of the community. And so that's what pastors and members are often doing. So they're a very important resource. And what your question, kind of implied too, is that they're under threat because they're often in very valuable real estate. Depending on the denomination, um, they may have declining membership, trying to figure out how they're going to pay for things. And a private developer approaches them with what sounds like a great deal. And there are many Harlem churches that no longer exist, because the developer said they were going to build a high rise and they would have space in the first floor. And something happened and all of that didn't come into fruition. Some have happened according to plan, but some have not. And, in Manhattan, they're under threat.
Yeah. I think it's so important to realize that, when we say this big term gentrification, a lot of people seem to think that it's like the bigger buildings that are what affects the community the most. But what we have found is that these churches are these centers that the people are gathering, and that's actually, that's what's affecting the people the most. As we're finishing up, we want to also ask about advice on what we can do as an organization. And as the director of the Local Initiative Support Corporation, what have you found to be effective in community development?
The Local Initiative Support Corporation, just by its name, Local Initiatives, they were saying exactly what you just said, is that, okay, we want to support the local ideas of development. And I was a program director for 6 years, working on programs in Newark and Philadelphia and in Cleveland. And the base was really of who we worked with was community development corporations, the nonprofits in neighborhoods. If there wasn't one in a neighborhood, we tried to maybe help organizations find one in the city that might be interested in working in that neighborhood. And New York has a very sophisticated nonprofit development industry. And that is a great advantage because, it's very likely that you could make a collaboration with an organization that can bring their experience so you don't have to reinvent the wheel in Washington Heights. And
Yep.
the key challenge is how do you kind of take properties out of the market? How do you protect them from the market might be a better way to
Yep.
say it, because the market is just, it's not slowing down. And, even before all this, the market was not creating affordable housing. And so whether it's the HDFCs, that program, or community land trusts, or I'm not even sure who the commissioner of housing preservation and development is now, but I would hope that the Adams administration has some vehicles for nonprofits working in the environment that we're discussing, because that's what really happened in New York. Actually, during the administration of Ed Koch, they had a 10-year housing plan in the 80s, and out of that, they identified neighborhoods where the city owned a lot of land. They put together a program to identify organizations in those neighborhoods. When there weren't organizations, they worked with foundations to provide support to help them get started. That's how the Abyssinia Development Corporation got started. And so it wasn't just by chance that these neighborhoods in Brooklyn, the Bronx, and Manhattan got renovated. And so I think there's probably, not probably, there is actually, there's a need now, is different than then, because then the challenge was nobody was investing. That's not the challenge now. But the challenge is there's still a need for housing for low and moderate income people. And to do that, people have to decide they're not going to make $1 million per apartment in a development. And that's a different kind of discussion. But so when I think long-term, why that is necessary is if we're not careful, we're going to have a city, I've never been to Dubai, where you have all of these high rises, very, very wealthy people, and maybe the poor people live in a ring, working class people who service them live in a ring 30 miles outside of the city and commute in. And, just kind of daily what that does. But if you think about what kind of city that is, it's a very different city, than Washington Heights now, which is a walkable neighborhood. People, like you mentioned, those connections, people go to the bodega, they go to the church. That is not going to last if there's not an intervention. And the city, state, federal government, they're the ones, but sometimes that intervention, the idea of the need for an intervention comes from the neighborhood level.
Yeah.
And that's the role that organizations in Washington Heights, the churches, people who know they need this, that's where that can come from. And there are models of, some of that I mentioned. And I would really wonder like when you go to the HPD website, like what kind of programs are they talking about?
No.
And I kind of don't think they're talking about what I'm saying, but I think like there needs to be a really ambitious intervention. Because I think what happened is that some people are so excited that you're able to make money in real estate in neighborhoods like this after all these decades when it was very hard to, that they can't see the downside of that.
Yeah.
And there is. And even for the people who move to neighborhoods in some of those new buildings, thinking they're going to live in a vibrant community, that it's not going to be vibrant. Actually, it's going to be a different kind of vibrant, maybe, but it's not going to be the kind of vibrant they were expecting.
Yeah. I think a lot of people are chasing profit nowadays. So that's unfortunately where it seems to be heading.
Right. That's not their purpose. And that's why they should be leaned on.
Yeah. No, exactly. Well, I guess as a final question, we are students of Columbia, and unfortunately, that is one of the largest agents of gentrification in New York. So, how would you say we should approach this dilemma?
1982, when I started business school, I remember at the orientation in US Hall, they told us that it was unsafe to go above 120th Street. And so that's how Columbia Business School, whoever was doing that orientation, viewed Harlem and other areas. And I lived at 122nd Street then in a Columbia-owned building. So I knew, that just was not true. And I already been exploring Harlem, using common sense because I had lived in Cleveland before. But Columbia has shifted with that Manhattanville campus to embrace their position in Harlem because they used to separate themselves and focus on being in Morningside Heights. But what I watched as they were, I went to one of the meetings, this would have probably been like 2009 or something like that, when Lee Bollinger was speaking at the Schomburg, I think it was, about Columbia's plans. And he really leaned in hard that they were part of Harlem and that. And so Washington Heights, Harlem, they, so I guess what I'm saying is they're in a position now where they need to continue to establish their commitment to neighborhoods. And even if you look at the way that Manhattanville campus happened, there was a lot of pushback from local organizations.
Oh, yeah.
Some of the properties that they purchased, there was a advocacy for them. It wasn't against them building, but it was saying, well, why do you have to have everything? Why can't you have your buildings and leave these buildings here too? And from a real estate developer point of view, I know it made it more from a design point of view for them to have everything, but they really steamrolled over people. And so I believe they're in a position now where they have to find ways to show that they're committed to working class people in neighborhoods, because there were people who were ousted from those buildings in Manhattanville who I know don't feel that, and it's not a feeling, it's like they live that, the
Yeah.
opposite of it. And so I think they should be looking for every kind of opportunity they can to show that they can support it. Even in Manhattanville, there was supposed to be a fund for, I think it was an affordable housing fund or something. I'm not sure what happened with it, but there's a lot of resentment because I do know people who were involved in that. And so they really do need to demonstrate their commitment to neighborhoods. And your project could be one way for them to do that. Like from a strategy point of view, there's one person who I think is still there. Like whoever their community relations or community outreach people are, that would be the place to start, I think.
Okay.
But also probably people, you may have already been talking with people in the urban planning department there.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Urban planning, urban sociology.
yeah, because
Yeah.
they're looking at all this, they're teaching it. And so
Yeah.
um, but I would encourage you to, you know, talk with them about what they can do. Because like the 1980s isn't that far away, even to some people it may seem that way. And so, you know, they were not embracing Harlem, being in Harlem then, and now they are. And you know, Harlem knows who they are. You
Yeah.
know? And so they've got to continue, like just saying it is not enough. Like they
Of
really do
course.
need to demonstrate. And I know they do have some programs and outreach and things like that. But this is an initiative that can really change people's lives, and their ability to stay in that community in ways that the people in Manhattanville were not able to do. Yeah.
Yep. Exactly. Well, thank you so much for all your information regarding not only Harlem, but how we can use that information to analyze Washington Heights and all your great
Pleasure.
advice. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, let me know if I can help in any way.